At 2:30 a.m. on March 28, 1971, Specialist 4 Dennis Schulte was on guard duty at Fire Support Base Mary Ann when he heard the first 82mm mortar shell whistle through the darkness. He dove for cover in his bunker as the round exploded 40 yards away, sending shrapnel tearing through sandbags and wooden ammunition crates. In the next 90 seconds, 39 more mortar rounds would rain down on the hilltop firebase, and in the chaos and smoke and confusion, 50 men wearing nothing but shorts and grease would slip through 10 rows of barbed wire without triggering a single alarm, without alerting a single sentry, and destroy an American firebase from the inside out. The official U.S. Army Field Manual listed 23 approved defensive measures for perimeter security. Fire Support Base. Mary Ann had implemented 19 of them, but regulations and defensive wire and claymore mines meant nothing when your enemy had spent 3 months learning every single pattern, every guard rotation, every weakness, every blind spot. The sappers had been warned by battalion command that this base was one of the best defended in the sector, manned by one of the most professional companies in Vietnam. But the sappers knew something command didn't. They knew that on March 27, 1971, not a single American on that hilltop believed they were in danger, and that belief would cost 30 men their lives. Nguyen Van Minh grew up in a village 40 kilometers south of Hanoi, where his father worked rice paddies that had belonged to his family for 6 generations. The soil was red clay that stuck to your hands, to your feet, to everything. As a boy, Nguyen learned to move through those paddies in absolute silence. His father taught him to walk heel to toe, to distribute his weight, to test each step before committing. You had to. The paddies were shared with snakes, with leeches, with things that could kill you if you weren't careful. His father would say, "The paddy teaches patience. The paddy teaches precision. The man who rushes drowns." In 1966, when Nguyen was 19, North Vietnamese army recruiters came to his village. They weren't looking for ordinary soldiers. They were looking for men who could move quietly, who could think independently, who could control fear. Men who understood that victory came not from overwhelming force, but from knowing exactly where to strike. Nguyen volunteered, not because he understood politics or communism or the grand strategy of reunification. He volunteered because 14 months earlier, an American B-52 strike had missed its target by 3 kilometers and destroyed his village. His father, his mother, his 2 younger sisters, all dead in 90 seconds because someone in an aircraft 30,000 feet up had made a calculation error. The recruiter looked at Nguyen's hands, scarred from years of farming, calloused but steady. "Can you be patient?" the recruiter asked. "Can you watch an enemy for weeks without moving?" Nguyen thought about the time he'd waited 8 hours in a rice paddy to trap a water snake that had been stealing fish from his family's pond. "Yes," he said. The recruiter nodded. "Report to Camp 42 in 2 weeks. You're going to become Dak Kong." The training camp was 60 kilometers west of Hanoi, hidden in triple canopy jungle so thick that American reconnaissance aircraft flew over it daily and never saw it. 200 men had arrived for training. Within 3 weeks, 40 had washed out, not because they couldn't handle the physical demands, but because they couldn't handle the psychological pressure of absolute precision under absolute stress. The first month was reconnaissance training, not map reading or compass navigation, though they learned those too. This was surveillance training that bordered on obsession. The instructors would take the trainees to mock-up American bases, exact replicas built from intelligence reports, and photographs stolen from South Vietnamese sources. Then they'd tell the trainees to observe. For 12 hours, for 18 hours, for 24 hours straight, without moving, without making a sound. Count the guards, the instructors would say. Learn their rotation, learn their habits. Does the guard at position 3 smoke? Does he lean his rifle against the sandbags when he lights his cigarette? How long does it take him to smoke it? 90 seconds? 2 minutes? That's your window. That's when you move. Nguyen learned to identify American soldiers by silhouette, the way a Marine carried himself differently than an Army infantryman, the way a new soldier on his first week in country moved differently than a veteran with 6 months left on his tour, the way an officer walked with his shoulders back, chest out, while an experienced NCO moved with economy, wasting no motion. Every detail mattered because every detail could mean the difference between mission success and death. The second month was infiltration training. The instructors built wire obstacles identical to American defensive perimeters, concertina wire, double apron fences, tanglefoot wire strung 4 inches off the ground. Then they added pressure-sensitive alarms, trip flares, and in some cases, actual claymore mines. The wire is not your enemy, the chief instructor said. His name was Senior Colonel Tran, a veteran of the French Indochina War, who had survived 14 combat operations and bore scars from burns, shrapnel, and a bullet wound that had taken half his left ear. Fear is your enemy. Impatience is your enemy. The wire is just an obstacle, and every obstacle has a solution. They learned to cut wire using captured American wire cutters, wrapping the jaws in cloth to muffle the sound. They learned to spread the cut ends slowly, maintaining tension so the wire wouldn't spring back and make noise. They learned to create gaps just wide enough to slip through, 14 inches at shoulder width, while lying flat. But more importantly, they learned when not to cut. They learned to identify weak points in wire placement, where you could slip between strands if you were patient enough, flexible enough, willing to spend 20 minutes moving 6 feet. Nguyen was small, 5 feet 6 inches, and 125 pounds. His instructor told him this was an advantage. Big men think strength is power. Small men learn that precision is power. You will go places big men cannot go. You will move in ways big men cannot move. They practiced crawling through obstacle courses in the dark. The instructors would wait until the moon was new, until the jungle was so black you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and then they'd send the trainees into the wire. Some nights they'd add live ammunition, firing machine guns 2 feet over the obstacle course. Fear was part of the training. Learning to function while terrified was part of the training. The third month was demolitions. Nguyen and his fellow trainees learned to build satchel charges from captured American C4 plastic explosive. They learned to shape charges to maximize blast effect, to calculate detonation timing, to create remote triggers from abandoned radio parts. But more than the technical knowledge, they learned the art of target selection. You have 90 seconds once the mortars start, Colonel Tran said. Maybe 2 minutes if you're lucky. You cannot waste time on secondary targets. You must know before you enter the perimeter exactly what you're going to destroy. Command bunker first, always. Kill the head, and the body dies. Then communications, then artillery, then fuel and ammunition if you have time, but always in that order. They ran practice missions against mock bases over and over until the sequence was muscle memory. Slip through the wire, navigate to the command post, place the satchel charge, move to communications, place the second charge. Keep moving, never stop, Never engage individual soldiers unless you have no choice. Your targets are not men, they are systems. Destroy the systems, and you destroy the base. The fourth month was political indoctrination, but by then it was almost unnecessary. The trainees had bonded through shared hardship. They'd watched men wash out, watched men quit, watched men break under the pressure. The ones who remained had become something different. Not quite soldiers in the conventional sense. They were specialists, precision instruments of war. Nguyen graduated in December 1966. Of the 200 men who'd started training, 41 graduated. He was assigned to the 409th Sapper Battalion, operating in Quang Tin Province in the northern part of South Vietnam. His unit's mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. They were to identify, surveil, and destroy American and South Vietnamese firebases, command posts, and supply depots, not through conventional assault, which would be suicide given American firepower superiority, through infiltration, precision demolition, and rapid withdrawal. Economy of force, they called it. The few attacking the many, the weak striking the strong, where the strong never expected to be struck. Fire Support Base. Mary Ann was established in January 1970 on a hilltop in Quang Tin Province, 30 miles west of Chu Lai. The hill was 4,000 feet up, bulldozed flat to create a fire base that could dominate the K7 corridor, a branch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail used by North Vietnamese forces to move supplies south. The base was roughly circular, 300 yards in diameter, ringed by bunkers, wire, and claymore mines. At its peak, it housed approximately 230 American soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, known as the Professionals, along with 21 South Vietnamese soldiers from an ARVN artillery battery. The base's defenses followed standard U.S. Army doctrine. The perimeter was ringed by 10 rows of concertina wire, each row 3 feet high, stretched in overlapping patterns designed to slow and channel attackers. Between the wire rows were tanglefoot obstacles, low-strung wire meant to trip infiltrators in the dark. Claymore mines were emplaced at intervals around the perimeter, each one facing outward, packed with 700 steel ball bearings and triggered by tripwire or remote detonator. Guard bunkers were positioned every 50 yards, each one manned by at least 2 soldiers with interlocking fields of fire. Illumination flares were scattered around the perimeter on stakes, designed to light up the killing zone if an attack developed. The Battalion Tactical Operations Center, the command post, was centrally located in a bunker built from wooden ammunition crates and sandbags. On paper, Fire Support Base Mary Ann was formidable. In reality, by March 1971, it had become complacent. The base had been operational for 13 months. In that entire time, it had taken sporadic mortar fire, maybe a dozen attacks total, none particularly accurate. It had never been probed on the ground, never experienced a serious assault. The surrounding area seemed quiet. Local intelligence suggested the North Vietnamese had pulled back, focusing their attention on operations in Laos during Operation Lam Son 719. The prevailing sentiment among both officers and enlisted men was that Mary Ann was a relatively safe posting, not quite rear echelon, but close enough. This complacency manifested in small but critical ways. Guard rotations became predictable following the same schedule night after night. Soldiers on guard duty would smoke cigarettes, the glowing tips visible from 200 yards away in the dark. Some guards would doze off, especially during the dead hours between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. when nothing ever happened. The claymore mines remained in the same positions for weeks, never moved, never inspected. Trip flares that burned out or were triggered by helicopter rotor wash weren't always replaced. The tanglefoot wire, which required constant maintenance to remain effective, sagged in places, creating gaps. These weren't failures of courage or dedication. These were failures of discipline born from months of monotony and a growing belief that the war was winding down, that going home mattered more than maintaining peak readiness. Lieutenant Colonel William Doyle, the battalion commander, was a serious professional. So was Captain Richard Knight, the Charlie Company commander who led the garrison at Mary Ann. They ran periodic inspections, enforced standards where they could, tried to maintain readiness. But by early 1971, maintaining peak combat readiness in Vietnam had become increasingly difficult. Drug use was widespread. Racial tensions were high. Many soldiers had stopped believing in the mission, in the war, in anything except survival and getting back to the world. Officers who pushed too hard risked fragging, the practice of enlisted men killing their own officers with fragmentation grenades. It had happened in other units. Everyone knew it. So standards slipped. Not catastrophically, but enough. Enough that when Nguyen Van Minh and his Sapper team began their reconnaissance of Fire Support Base Mary Ann in December 1970, they saw the gaps almost immediately. Nguyen's mission began with surveillance. For 3 months, he and 5 other sappers from his cell lived in the jungle 800 yards from Fire Support Base Mary Ann. They built hide sites, carefully camouflaged positions where they could observe the base through binoculars for 12 to 16 hours a day. They watched. They learned. They documented everything. They learned that the guard at Bunker 7 smoked Marlboro cigarettes at exactly 11:45 p.m. every night during his shift. They learned that he would lean his M16 against the sandbag wall while he lit the cigarette, and that it took him approximately 90 seconds to smoke it. They learned that the guards changed at midnight, 4 a.m., and 8 a.m., the same schedule every night. They learned that between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., the base was quietest, with several guards visibly nodding off. They learned the exact positions of every claymore mine around the perimeter. This took weeks of patient observation, watching where soldiers walked during the day when they serviced the defenses, noting the slight mounds in the earth where mines were buried. They learned which trip flares were functional and which had burned out and not been replaced. They learned the blind spots in the base's defensive layout, the areas where overlapping fields of fire from guard bunkers didn't quite overlap. At night, when the moon was dark, Nguyen would creep forward, not to the wire, not yet, but close enough to smell the base. American fire bases had a distinct smell: diesel fuel from generators, cigarette smoke, the chemical tang of insect repellent. He would lie in the tall grass 50 yards from the perimeter and simply observe, listening to the sounds, the rhythm of the base, learning to distinguish between normal activity and alert status. 3 times he crawled all the way to the wire. Not through it, just to it, testing, learning. He would place his hand on the concertina wire, feeling the tension, too loose and you could spread it silently, too tight, and cutting it would cause the whole section to recoil and make noise. The wire at Fire Support Base. Mary Ann was old, installed when the base was built 13 months ago. It had sagged in places. Good. He would find a spot where the wire was looser, spread the coils apart without cutting, slip through the gap. Then he'd reverse the process, pulling the wire back into place behind him. No evidence, no alarm, no trace that anyone had been there. By March 1971, Nguyen had created a hand-drawn map of Fire Support Base Mary Ann that was more accurate than the base's own defensive plans. He knew every bunker position, every guard rotation, every weak point in the perimeter. He knew where the command post was located. He knew where the communications bunker was. He knew where the artillery battery positioned their 105mm howitzers. He knew which sections of wire could be penetrated silently and which would require cutting. He knew the exact route he would take from the perimeter to the command post, 85 yards through the interior of the base, navigating between bunkers and sleeping quarters. He reported his findings to his commander in mid-March. "The base can be taken," he said. "They are not alert. Their defenses have gaps. We can penetrate without detection." His commander studied the map Nguyen had drawn, noting every detail. "How many men?" 50. 3 assault teams of 12 men each, 1 blocking team of 14 to secure the withdrawal route. We'll need mortar support to create confusion during the initial penetration. Casualties? Impossible to predict, but if we maintain surprise, if we move quickly, most of us will make it out. The commander nodded. "The attack is approved. Rehearse your teams. You have 2 weeks. For 14 days, Nguyen and his 49 fellow sappers rehearsed the attack on a full-scale mock-up of fire support base Mary Ann built in a jungle clearing 15 kilometers away. Intelligence had provided photographs taken from observation posts. Nguyen had provided his reconnaissance maps. Engineers had used these to construct an exact replica, wire obstacles in the same positions, mock bunkers in the same layout. Even the distance from the perimeter to the command post was exact, 85 yards. They ran the assault over and over, first in daylight, learning the routes, then at dusk, then in darkness, wearing nothing but shorts and covered in grease to reduce their thermal signature and make them harder to see. Each man had a specific target. Nguyen's team would hit the command bunker and the communications center. The second assault team would target the artillery battery, placing charges on the 100mm howitzers and the ammunition bunker. The third team would strike the fuel depot and any vehicles they could reach. The blocking team would secure the withdrawal route, engaging any American reinforcements or reaction forces. They practiced with live explosives, satchel charges packed with 6 pounds of C4 and TNT, each one wrapped in canvas and fitted with a 30-second fuse. Each sapper would carry 3 charges, 18 pounds of explosives per man. They practiced placing the charges, lighting the fuses, moving to the next target. Speed was everything. Once the first charge detonated, surprise would be lost. They'd have maybe 60 seconds before organized resistance developed. Everything had to be done in that 60-second window. Colonel Tron observed the rehearsals personally. On the last night before the operation, he gathered all 50 sappers together. "You have trained well," he said. "You know your targets. You know your routes. You know that success depends on 3 things: surprise, speed, discipline." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "Some of you will not come back. That is the nature of this work. But if you do this correctly, if you maintain discipline, most of you will survive, and you will have destroyed an American firebase without losing a single conventional infantry soldier. That is economy of force. That is why we do this." Nguyen felt the weight of those words. He'd been on 6 previous operations, all successful. All had resulted in some casualties. On his 3rd operation, his closest friend had been killed when a claymore mine detonated prematurely. On his 5th operation, he'd taken shrapnel from an American grenade, small pieces of steel that were still embedded in his left shoulder. He knew the risks. He'd accepted them. But he also knew that this operation was different. larger, more complex, more dangerous. On the night of March 27, 1971, the Sapper teams moved into position. They'd approached Fire Support Base Marianne from the south, using a concealed route through thick jungle that Nguyen had identified during his reconnaissance. By 10 p.m., they were in their assault positions, 200 yards from the perimeter. They waited. Nguyen lay in the grass, his body covered in a mixture of grease and charcoal dust. The grease served two purposes. It darkened his skin, making him harder to see in the dark, and it made his body slippery, allowing him to slide through narrow gaps in the wire. The charcoal dust eliminated any shine from the grease. In the darkness, he was nearly invisible. He watched the base through binoculars. Everything was proceeding as he'd observed over the past 3 months. The guard at Bunker 7 lit his cigarette at 11:47 p.m., 2 minutes later than usual, but close enough. The midnight guard change happened exactly on schedule. By 1 a.m., the base had settled into its deepest sleep. Only the perimeter guards were awake, and based on what Nguyen could see through his binoculars, at least 3 of them appeared to be dozing. At 2:15 a.m., Nguyen gave the signal, a single bird call, a pattern that wouldn't sound unusual to American ears, but that his team recognized instantly. The mortar teams, positioned 200 yards to the west, began their countdown. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the first 82mm mortar round left the tube. Dennis Schulte heard the incoming round and dove for his bunker. The explosion erupted 40 yards away, and then the world became noise and confusion. Mortar rounds rained down on Fire Support Base Marianne, 40 rounds in 90 seconds, each one carefully aimed not at the perimeter bunkers, but at the interior of the base. The command post, the communication center, the sleeping quarters. The mortar attack wasn't designed to kill, though it would. It was designed to create chaos, to pin down the defenders, to make them focus inward on survival rather than outward on perimeter security. While the mortar rounds fell, Nguyen and his teams moved forward. They covered 200 yards in 2 minutes, moving in absolute silence despite the explosions. When they reached the wire, they didn't hesitate. The first row was concertina wire, and Nguyen had already identified the gap he would use. He lay flat, slid his body into the opening between coils, pushed gently to widen the gap, and squeezed through. His greased skin helped him slip through spaces that would have been impossible for a larger man. The second row was tanglefoot wire, low-strung. He duck-walked through it, testing each step, feeling for the wire with his hands before committing his weight. Behind him, his team members followed in single file, each man moving through the exact path Nguyen cleared. No one spoke. No one made a sound louder than breathing. The 3rd through 10th rows of wire took 11 minutes to penetrate. Nguyen moved like water, flowing through gaps, spreading wire with infinite patience, pulling it back into place behind him. At several points, he had to cut wire, using cloth-wrapped cutters to muffle the sound. Each cut was deliberate, slow, maintaining tension on the wire so it wouldn't spring back. By 2:43 a.m., all 3 assault teams and the blocking force had penetrated the perimeter without triggering a single alarm, without alerting a single guard. The mortar barrage had masked any small sounds they made. The defenders were focused on the explosions, on taking cover, on survival. They weren't looking outward. They weren't watching the wire. Nguyen emerged from the wire inside the firebase perimeter. He could see the command bunker 85 yards ahead, partially obscured by smoke from the mortar impacts. He moved in a low crouch, using every bit of cover. A barrel there, a sandbag wall there. The mortar fire had stopped, That was the signal. The assault teams had 3 minutes before American reaction forces would organize. He reached the command bunker at 2:45 a.m. The entrance was a standard doorway. No guard posted outside because who would expect an enemy to penetrate this deep into the base? Nguyen pulled a tear gas grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and tossed it through the doorway. Then he moved to the side and waited. 5 seconds later, he heard coughing, shouting, confusion. From inside the bunker, men stumbled out the doorway, gasping for air, blinded by the gas. Nguyen ignored them. His target wasn't men, it was the bunker itself. He pulled a satchel charge from his back, lit the 30-second fuse, and tossed it through the doorway into the command bunker. Then he ran. Behind him, members of his team were hitting the communications bunker with the same tactic. Tear gas to clear it, satchel charge to destroy it. The third team had reached the artillery battery and was placing charges on the 105mm howitzers. Everything was happening simultaneously. 50 men executing a choreographed assault on a base that had no idea what was happening. At 2:46 a.m., the first satchel charge detonated inside the command bunker. The explosion blew out the walls, sending wooden ammunition crates and sandbags flying. Captain Richard Knight, the Charlie Company commander, was inside when the charge detonated. He died instantly, along with most of his command staff. The communications center exploded 3 seconds later, destroying all radio equipment, severing the base's ability to call for help or coordinate a defense. Now the base was awake. Soldiers poured out of sleeping quarters, confused, disoriented. Most had no idea what was happening. The mortar attack had ended, but explosions were erupting from inside the perimeter. Many soldiers thought they were still under mortar fire and took cover in their bunkers, which was exactly what the sappers had counted on. Nguyen's team moved to their secondary targets: fuel storage, vehicle park, ammunition bunker. Each sapper carried 3 charges, each charge meticulously placed for maximum effect. They worked with mechanical efficiency, no wasted motion, no panic. They'd rehearsed this 40 times over 2 weeks. Their bodies knew what to do, even as chaos erupted around them. But now resistance was forming. Individual American soldiers were engaging the sappers with rifle fire. Nguyen saw 2 of his team members go down, hit by M16 fire from a guard bunker. The blocking team returned fire with AK-47s, trying to suppress the resistance and buy time for the assault teams to complete their mission. At 2:49 a.m., Nguyen had placed all 3 of his charges. Command bunker destroyed, communications destroyed, fuel dump ignited, flames climbing 50 feet into the night sky. He gave the withdrawal signal, 2 sharp whistle blasts, and his teams began moving back toward the perimeter. The withdrawal was always the most dangerous phase. Surprise was gone. The base was alert. American soldiers were firing from bunkers, from fighting positions, from anywhere they could find cover. Nguyen's blocking team laid down suppressing fire, emptying magazine after magazine to cover the assault team's withdrawal. They reached the wire at 2:52 a.m. Getting out was faster than getting in because stealth no longer mattered. They cut through the wire with bolt cutters, hacking gaps big enough to run through. Behind them, fire, support base. Mary Ann was burning. Secondary explosions erupted as ammunition cooked off in the flames. The base was consuming itself. By 2:57 a.m., Nguyen and 43 other sappers had withdrawn through the wire and melted into the jungle. 7 sappers had been killed during the assault and withdrawal. Their bodies would be recovered later that night, if possible, or abandoned if not. That was the calculation. The mission had succeeded. The base's command structure had been destroyed. The communications center was gone. The artillery battery was damaged. One American helicopter had been destroyed on the ground. Fires were raging through multiple structures. American casualties would be counted later. 30 American soldiers killed, 82 wounded, the highest single-incident casualties for a fire base during the later years of the war. 15 sapper bodies were recovered from within the perimeter, though blood trails indicated more had been killed or wounded and evacuated by their surviving comrades. When the sun rose, on March 28, 1971, Fire Support Base Mary Ann was a smoking ruin. The brigade commander, Colonel Hathaway, flew in by helicopter at first light. His reaction was later described as if he'd walked into Auschwitz. Bodies everywhere. Wounded soldiers being evacuated by medevac helicopters. Bunkers destroyed. The command structure completely gone. The division commander, Major General James Baldwin, arrived at 7 a.m. to assess the damage. By 9 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Doyle had been evacuated with a leg wound and would never return to command. By 11 a.m., Company C was being replaced as the garrison element, though by then everyone knew the base would be abandoned. The official investigation that followed was brutal. The 23rd Infantry Division's Inspector General and the MACV Inspector General both conducted separate inquiries. The findings traced failures all the way up the chain of command. Inadequate defensive measures, lax security procedures, predictable guard rotations, failure to maintain wire obstacles, failure to replace burned-out trip flares, failure to conduct adequate patrols outside the perimeter that might have detected the Sapper reconnaissance. In July 1971, Major General Baldwin was relieved of command, effectively ending his career. Colonel Hathaway's career stalled. Multiple junior officers received letters of reprimand. The official narrative blamed complacency, drug use, racial tensions, and the general decline in morale that characterized American units in Vietnam during the later years of the war. But that narrative missed the larger point. Fire Support Base Mary Ann wasn't destroyed because American soldiers were incompetent or drugged or unmotivated. It was destroyed because North Vietnamese sappers had elevated infiltration and demolition to an art form, a specialized capability that American doctrine had never fully addressed. The sappers had spent 3 months learning everything about that fire base. Tatai, months of patient observation, meticulous planning, exhaustive rehearsal. They'd identified every weakness, every gap, every predictable pattern, and then they'd struck with surgical precision at the exact moment when their chances of success were highest. This was the genius of sapper operations, economy of force taken to its logical extreme. 50 men destroying a base defended by 231. Minimal casualties on the attacking side. Maximum psychological impact. The message was clear. No American fire base, no matter how well defended, was truly safe. The sappers could be anywhere, watching from the jungle, learning your patterns, waiting for the moment when you let your guard down. The concept of Dak Cong, the special task soldiers, had deep roots in Vietnamese military tradition. During the 13th century Mongol invasions, Vietnamese forces under Tran Quoc Tuan had used small elite units to attack Mongol encampments from within, destroying command structures and supply depots before melting back into the countryside. During the First Indochina War against the French, Viet Minh sappers had infiltrated fortified French positions, most famously during the siege of Dien Bien Phu, where sapper teams had destroyed aircraft on the ground and collapsed sections of the defensive perimeter. But during the American War, as the Vietnamese called it, Sapper operations reached their peak sophistication after the devastating losses of the 1968 Tet Offensive, when Viet Cong main force units had been decimated in conventional attacks against urban targets. The North Vietnamese High Command shifted strategy. Instead of large-scale conventional assaults that played to American strengths in firepower and logistics, they would emphasize small unit operations that exploited American weaknesses in static defense and predictable patterns. In 1968, the North Vietnamese High Command established the 429th Sapper Group, which reported directly to the Sapper High Command in Hanoi. This organization centralized control, training, and doctrine for all Sapper operations in South Vietnam. Training centers were established in North Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and secure areas of South Vietnam. The instruction could last from 3 to 18 months, depending on the role. The curriculum emphasized reconnaissance, infiltration, demolitions, and close-quarters combat, but above all, it emphasized patience and discipline. Approximately 50,000 men served as sappers in the People's Army of Vietnam during the war. They were organized into groups of 100 to 150 men, broken down into companies of 30 to 36 men, further divided into platoons, squads, and three-man cells. The cellular structure provided security and flexibility. If one cell was compromised, the others remained operational. Sappers were elite troops, volunteers selected for specific psychological and physical traits. They had to be small enough to slip through narrow gaps in wire obstacles. They had to be patient enough to lie motionless for hours during reconnaissance. They had to be disciplined enough to follow mission parameters exactly, avoiding unnecessary combat with individual enemy soldiers. And they had to be brave enough to infiltrate an enemy base, knowing that if they were caught, they would almost certainly die. The training was exhaustive. Physical conditioning that included miles of crawling, swimming, climbing. Technical training in demolitions, wire cutting, mine clearing. Tactical training in small unit operations, fire and maneuver, ambush, counter-ambush. But the most important training was reconnaissance and infiltration. Sappers spent weeks learning to observe enemy positions, to identify patterns, to exploit weaknesses. They learned to move through wire obstacles using techniques that seemed impossible. They could spread concertina wire and slip through gaps 12 inches wide. They could navigate tanglefoot wire in absolute darkness. They could disarm American Claymore mines and turn them around to face the American positions. Sapper operations followed a standard methodology that became almost ritual. First came the reconnaissance phase, which could last weeks or months. Sapper teams would observe the target from concealed positions, documenting guard rotations, defensive measures, patrol patterns, weak points. They would create detailed maps and models. In some cases, they would infiltrate the perimeter repeatedly during the reconnaissance phase, testing defenses, mapping interior layouts, even positioning weapons and explosives inside the base to be triggered during the actual assault. Second came the rehearsal phase. Full-scale mock-ups of the target would be constructed in secure areas. The assault would be rehearsed dozens of times, first in daylight, then at dusk, then in darkness. Each sapper would know his exact route, his exact targets, his exact withdrawal path. Timing would be practiced obsessively. The difference between success and failure often came down to seconds. Third came the assault itself, typically launched at night, often during the darkest phase of the lunar cycle. Mortar or rocket fire would begin the attack, creating confusion and pinning defenders. While the defenders focused on the bombardment, sapper teams would infiltrate the perimeter. The entire operation from penetration to withdrawal might last 15 minutes. Speed was essential. Once surprise was lost, the sappers had to complete their mission and escape before American firepower could be brought to bear. The effectiveness of sapper operations was devastating. Between 1965 and 1972, sappers conducted hundreds of successful attacks on American and South Vietnamese positions. They destroyed aircraft on the ground at Bien Hoa Air Base, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and Pochen Tong Air Base in Cambodia. They attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon during the Tet Offensive. They infiltrated MICV SOG Forward Operating Base 4 near Da Nang, killing a dozen Green Berets. They destroyed fuel depots, ammunition dumps, command posts, and artillery batteries throughout South Vietnam. But perhaps more important than the physical damage was the psychological impact. Sapper attacks created a pervasive sense of vulnerability among American and South Vietnamese forces. If a well-defended firebase like Mary Ann could be penetrated and destroyed, then nowhere was truly safe. Every base, every outpost, every position was potentially vulnerable. This psychological warfare was deliberate. The North Vietnamese understood that the American public's support for the war was fragile. High-profile disasters like the attack on Fire Support Base Mary Ann eroded that support, making it harder for American political leaders to justify continued involvement. The American response to sapper tactics evolved slowly. Initially, the U.S. military relied on conventional defensive measures: more wire, more mines, more guard posts, more patrols. But these measures were only effective if they were properly maintained and if defenders remained vigilant. Complacency was the sappers' greatest ally. A firebase that had gone months without an attack would gradually relax its defensive posture. Guard rotations would become predictable. Wire wouldn't be inspected or maintained. Patrols would become routine rather than random. Some American units developed effective counter-sapper tactics: random guard rotations that changed every night, unpredictable patrol schedules outside the perimeter, regular inspection and maintenance of defensive obstacles, use of ground surveillance radar and night vision devices to detect infiltrators, random illumination of the perimeter with flares and searchlights, aggressive patrolling to deny sappers the ability to conduct reconnaissance. The most effective counter-sapper measure was psychological, maintaining constant vigilance and unpredictability. Sappers relied on patterns, on learning the rhythms of a base. If a base had no discernible patterns, if guard rotations changed randomly, if defensive measures were constantly adjusted, then reconnaissance became nearly impossible. But maintaining that level of vigilance required strong leadership, high morale, and a shared belief in the mission. By 1971, many American units lacked all three. Nguyen Van Minh survived the attack on Fire Support Base Mary Ann. He participated in 4 more sapper operations before the war ended in 1975. He was wounded twice, took shrapnel in his right leg during an assault on an ARVN base near Hue in 1972, and suffered burns when a satchel charge detonated prematurely in 1973. Of his original 3-man cell, he was the only survivor. His cell leader was killed in 1972. His 3rd team member was captured in 1974 and died in a South Vietnamese prison camp. After the war, Nguyen returned to his village south of Hanoi, or what remained of it. The American bombing had left craters that had filled with water and become fish ponds. The land his father had farmed was still there, though someone else farmed it now. He married, had 2 children, worked as a civil engineer helping to rebuild bridges destroyed during the war. He rarely talked about his time as a sapper. When asked, he would say only that he did what was necessary, what his country asked of him. The details were too painful, too complicated. The faces of men he'd killed haunted him, though he tried not to think about them. The faces of friends he'd lost haunted him more. In 1995, a Vietnamese military historian tracked Nguyen down for an oral history project documenting sapper operations during the war. Nguyen gave one interview, providing dates and operational details, but refusing to be identified by name. He described the reconnaissance phase, the training, the assault on Fire Support Base Mary Ann. When the historian asked if he felt proud of what he'd accomplished, Nguyen was quiet for a long time. "Pride is the wrong word," he finally said. "I did what I was trained to do. I survived when many did not. I helped end a war that had already lasted too long. But war is not something to be proud of. War is something to survive and then forget, if you can." The historian asked if he had any regrets. Nguyen thought about the American soldiers at Fire Support Base Mary Ann. Young men, most of them, far from home, fighting in a war they probably didn't understand any better than he had understood it. He thought about the split-second decisions, the satchel charges tossed through doorways, the explosions that had killed 30 men. "I regret the necessity of it," he said. "I regret that there was no other way. But I do not regret doing my duty. The Americans chose to come to my country. They chose to build their bases on our land. We chose to drive them out. That is the nature of war. Someone always dies. Someone always suffers. The only question is who." Dennis Schulte survived the attack on Fire Support Base Mary Ann. He was one of the lucky ones, suffering only minor shrapnel wounds. He was evacuated to Chu Lai, treated, and returned to duty 3 days later at a different fire base. He completed his tour in Vietnam in June 1971 and returned to his home in Ohio. He married his high school girlfriend, worked as a machinist, had 3 children. For years, he didn't talk about the night of March 28, 1971. The memories were too raw, too painful. The sound of mortar rounds screaming through the darkness, the explosions, the chaos, the realization that the enemy was inside the perimeter, inside the base, destroying everything from within. The feeling of absolute helplessness, of being unable to stop what was happening, of watching friends die and being unable to save them. In 1989, Schulte was contacted by a military historian named Keith Nolan, who was writing a book about the attack on Fire Support Base Mary Ann. Schulte agreed to be interviewed. He provided his account of that night, the details he remembered, the things he tried to forget. Talking about it helped a little. It didn't make the memories go away, but it put them in context. He wasn't alone. Other survivors remembered the same things, felt the same guilt at surviving when others hadn't. Nolan's book, Sappers in the Wire, was published in 1995. It provided the most comprehensive account of the attack, based on declassified documents and interviews with more than 50 veterans. The book revealed details that the official investigations had glossed over. The extent of the lapses in security, the predictability of the defensive patterns, the sophistication of the Sapper reconnaissance and planning. The book also revealed the extent of the cover-up, the way the official narrative had blamed drugs and morale problems when the real issue was systemic complacency and inadequate defensive doctrine. Reading the book, Schulte finally understood what had happened that night. It wasn't that American soldiers at Fire Support Base Mary Ann were incompetent or negligent. It was that they'd been up against an enemy that had elevated infiltration warfare to a science, an enemy that had spent 3 months learning every detail of the base, every pattern, every weakness. An enemy that had trained for this exact mission for months, rehearsing every step, every movement, every action. An enemy that understood American defensive doctrine better than most Americans did, and knew exactly how to exploit it. That understanding didn't make the memories easier, but it made them make sense. War is fundamentally about asymmetry, about finding advantages and exploiting them. The North Vietnamese couldn't match American firepower, so they developed tactics that made firepower irrelevant. They couldn't win conventional battles, so they fought unconventionally. They couldn't defend fixed positions, so they became mobile and elusive. And when they attacked in ways that American doctrine hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily counter. The legacy of Sapper operations extended far beyond the Vietnam War. In the decades that followed, the concept of small, highly trained special operations units conducting precision raids behind enemy lines became standard doctrine in militaries worldwide. The U.S. military's own Special Operations Forces, Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 and others, drew lessons from both successes and failures against Vietnamese sappers. The emphasis on unpredictability, on aggressive patrolling, on constant vigilance became core principles of base defense doctrine. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. Fire Support Base. Mary Ann became a case study in what happens when military units lose vigilance, when they become complacent, when they stop taking threats seriously because nothing has happened for a while. The attack demonstrated that in war, the moment you believe you're safe is the moment you're most vulnerable. The story of Nguyen Van Minh and Dennis Schulte, two men on opposite sides of an attack that lasted 15 minutes, but echoed for decades, is ultimately a story about the nature of war itself, about how ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things, to make impossible choices, to survive unimaginable circumstances, about how training and discipline and courage matter, but so do luck and timing and factors beyond anyone's control. Nguyen did exactly what he was trained to do. He observed, he planned, he executed with precision. He killed enemy soldiers and destroyed enemy equipment, and in doing so, he fulfilled his mission, served his country, contributed to the eventual North Vietnamese victory. 30 American soldiers died because Nguyen was good at his job. Dennis Schulte was in the wrong place at the wrong time, defending a base that had let its guard down, part of a military apparatus that was slowly grinding to a halt as American political will to continue the war collapsed. He survived through luck and the grace of God, as he'd later say, but 30 of his fellow soldiers didn't. Neither man was a hero in the traditional sense. Neither man was a villain. They were both soldiers doing what soldiers do, following orders, trying to survive, caught up in a war that neither of them had started and neither of them could stop. The attack on Fire Support Base Mary Ann ended at 3:07 a.m. on March 28, 1971. The sappers withdrew. The base burned. The dead were counted. The wounded were evacuated. Within a month, the base was abandoned. By June, the entire sector had been turned over to South Vietnamese forces as part of Vietnamization. By 1973, American combat forces had withdrawn from Vietnam entirely. By April 1975, Saigon fell, and the war was over. But for the men who survived that night, the war never really ended. It lived in their memories, in their nightmares, in the ways they flinched at sudden noises or felt uneasy in crowds. It lived in the questions they asked themselves. Could I have done something differently? Could I have saved him? Why did I survive when others didn't? These are the questions soldiers have asked themselves since war began. They're the questions Nguyen asked. They're the questions Dennis asked. They're the questions every survivor asks. And the terrible truth is that there are no good answers. War is chaos. Survival is often random. Courage and skill matter, but so does luck. The satchel charge that destroyed the command bunker at Fire Support Base. Mary Ann detonated at 2:46 a.m. on March 28, 1971. The explosion lasted less than a second. The shockwave propagated outward at 26,000 feet per second, shattering wood, tearing through sandbags, turning a command center into fragments. Captain Richard Knight died instantly, as did most of his command staff. They likely never knew what hit them. That's 30 seconds, the amount of time it takes to tie your shoes, to brew a cup of coffee, to check your phone. In 30 seconds, everything changed. A base was destroyed. 30 men died. Careers ended. Families received telegrams. Lives were altered forever. And it all happened because 50 men wearing nothing but shorts and grease had spent 3 months learning patterns, finding weaknesses, planning an assault that would exploit every gap in defensive doctrine. It happened because warfare is fundamentally about finding asymmetries and exploiting them. It happened because wars are not won by following doctrine, but by understanding when doctrine has blind spots and attacking through those blind spots. The attack on Fire Support Base Mary Ann was not unique. It was one of hundreds of sapper operations conducted throughout the Vietnam War. But it stands out because of its completeness, its audacity, the sophistication of its execution, and it stands out because it happened late in the war, when American forces should have understood the sapper threat, should have adjusted their defensive posture accordingly, should have maintained the vigilance necessary to prevent such an attack. The fact that they didn't, that Fire Support Base Mary Ann was destroyed so completely, reveals something fundamental about the nature of military operations. You can have all the firepower in the world, all the technology, all the resources, but if you don't maintain discipline, if you don't stay vigilant, if you allow patterns and complacency to develop, then all your advantages mean nothing. The enemy will find the gap, the enemy will exploit the weakness, and the enemy will strike exactly when you least expect it. That was the lesson of Fire Support Base Mary Ann. That was the lesson the North Vietnamese sappers taught through hundreds of operations over the course of the war, and it's a lesson that remains relevant today. In any conflict, in any military operation where defenders must maintain security over extended periods, the wire is still taught, the infiltration techniques, the reconnaissance methodology, the emphasis on patience and discipline and precision. Modern special operations forces around the world study sapper tactics, not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. The understanding that sometimes the most effective way to attack a superior force is not head-on, but from within, striking at the critical nodes that enable the enemy to function. But the names are mostly forgotten. Nguyen Van Min is a composite based on interviews with multiple sapper veterans, his real identity lost to history or deliberately obscured. The specific sappers who penetrated Fire Support Base Mary Ann remain anonymous, their identities known only to their surviving comrades, and perhaps recorded in classified Vietnamese military archives. That's fitting, in a way. Sappers weren't supposed to be heroes in the traditional sense. They weren't supposed to seek glory or recognition. They were supposed to accomplish their mission and vanish back into the darkness, leaving only destroyed targets and confusion behind them. They were ghosts, phantoms, shadows that slipped through wire and struck without warning and disappeared before anyone could respond. and they were extraordinarily effective. In the calculus of military operations, Sapper attacks achieved the highest return on investment of any tactic employed during the Vietnam War. 50 men could destroy a base defended by hundreds. The casualty ratios favored the attackers. The psychological impact was devastating. The material costs to repair or abandon the damaged bases was enormous, and the effect on American morale, both in Vietnam and at home, was corrosive. Fire Support Base Mary Ann was abandoned on April 24, 1971. The bunkers were destroyed. The wire was salvaged or left in place. The equipment was evacuated. The hilltop returned to jungle within months. Today, there's little evidence that a major American fire base ever existed there. The jungle has reclaimed it. Vines growing over the remnants of sandbag walls, trees sprouting from old fighting positions, but the memory remains. In American military history texts, Fire Support Base Mary Ann is studied as an example of what happens when defensive discipline fails. In Vietnamese military history, it's celebrated as an example of successful economy of force operations. Two different narratives, two different interpretations, both based on the same 15 minutes of violence on a hilltop in Quang Tin Province. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either narrative suggests. The attack on Fire Support Base. Mary Ann wasn't just about American defensive failures or Vietnamese tactical brilliance. It was about the cumulative effects of a long war grinding down both sides. It was about soldiers on both sides trying to survive, trying to complete their missions, trying to do their duty in circumstances that were often impossible. It was about asymmetric warfare, about how the weak can defeat the strong by refusing to fight on the strong's terms. It was about patience and planning and precision. It was about the gap between doctrine and reality, between what military manuals said should work and what actually worked in the chaos and confusion of combat. And ultimately, it was about the human cost of war. 30 American soldiers dead, 7 North Vietnamese sappers dead, 82 Americans wounded, unknown numbers of sappers wounded, families destroyed on both sides, lives altered forever, all for a hilltop firebase that would be abandoned within a month, fighting for a war that would be lost within 4 years. That's the real lesson of Fire Support Base Mary Ann. Not the tactical details, though those are important. Not the defensive failures, though those should be studied and learned from. The real lesson is about the cost of war, the price paid by ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, asked to do impossible things in service of goals they often didn't understand. War grinds people down. It breaks them physically and psychologically. The ones who survive carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives. That was true for Nguyen Van Min, who went home to farm rice in soil still scarred by bomb craters. That was true for Dennis Schulte, who went home to Ohio and tried to forget the night the base burned. That was true for every soldier, every sapper, every person touched by that night in March 1971. The wire can be taught, the tactics can be studied, the lessons can be applied to future conflicts, but the human cost remains incalculable, immeasurable, impossible to truly convey to anyone who wasn't there. That's the tragedy at the heart of every war. We can count the dead, we can tally the wounded, we can measure the material losses, but we can never truly measure the weight of memory, the burden of survival, the cost of having been there when the mortars fell and the sappers came through the wire and everything exploded into chaos and fire. At 2:30 a.m. on March 28, 1971, the first mortar round fell on Fire Support Base Mary Ann. 15 minutes later, the base was destroyed. 30 men were dead, and 50 sappers had proven that no position, no matter how well defended, was truly safe from an enemy willing to be patient, to watch, to learn, to wait for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came and went in 15 minutes, but its echoes continue, in military doctrine, in the nightmares of survivors, in the families who receive telegrams, in the history books and the memorial walls, and the lessons passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. The wire held, and then it didn't. That's the story of Fire Support Base Mary Ann. That's the story of sapper warfare. That's the story of Vietnam.